Mr. Duffield, I need a signature confirming you received this.
What is it?
Notice of default. Duffield's Diner. You're 21 days behind on the note, and the bank's called the loan.
I know what I owe. I don't need a piece of paper to tell me that.
I still need the signature.
There. Anything else?
You have 21 days to cure the default, or the bank moves to foreclose.
21 days. You want coffee while you wait for that to sound like news to me?
She didn't answer that. She folded her copy of the receipt and left, and the bell over the door rang the way it had rung 10,000 mornings before this one. Truett went back to the eggs, because a dozen people at the counter were still waiting on their breakfast, and none of it was their fault. He had no way of knowing that the person who would decide whether he kept this building already owed him something she didn't know how to name. He had even less way of knowing why. The diner had 2 speeds every morning. There was the 6 o'clock rush of contractors and night shift nurses who wanted eggs before the sun was fully up, plates moving fast, coffee refilled without being asked. Then there was the slower stretch after 8, when the regulars drifted in one at a time and stayed until their coffee went cold. Truett knew most of their orders before they sat down. He'd known some of them his whole life. Men who used to sit across from his father at the same booth by the window, arguing about nothing in particular because arguing about nothing was easier than talking about what actually worried them. Duffield's had been open 38 years. Truett's father had bought the building with a GI loan and a handshake from a landlord who liked his laugh, and he'd run the griddle himself until the week he died, 2 years ago, of a heart that had been quietly failing under the weight of the diner's debts for longer than anyone had told Truett. Truett was 29. He had been cooking behind that same griddle since he was 15, and running the whole place alone, mostly, since his father's funeral, and raising his sister since a week after that, because there wasn't anyone else left to do it. His father hadn't told anyone how bad the heart trouble was. Not the doctor's full warning, not the medication he'd stopped filling because the copay competed with payroll. He'd worked the morning shift the day before he died and complained once that the coffee machine was running slow, and nobody in that diner had known to be afraid. The regulars had raised over $4,000 for the funeral without being asked, folded into the tip jar in 5s and 10s over about 3 weeks, and Truett had never quite figured out how to thank them for it properly. He still tried most mornings in eggs. The diner itself hadn't changed much in 38 years. The same chrome-edged counter, worn smooth in the spots where forearms had rested for 3 decades. The same pie case with a hand-lettered sign taped to the glass, Pie of the Day, the word of the day scrawled and rewritten so many times the marker had worn a groove in the tape. A row of booths with red vinyl seats patched twice in the same 3 spots. It looked, to anyone passing on the street, like exactly what it was, a place that had survived by refusing to become anything else. "You're burning the hash browns," Tilly said from her stool at the end of the counter, not looking up from her homework. "I'm not burning the hash browns." "You're burning the hash browns." He was burning the hash browns. He scraped them off the griddle and started a new batch, and Tilly went back to her math, 10 years old and already better at fractions than he'd ever been. She'd come home from school the day before with her chin tucked low, and it had taken him 20 minutes of careful questions to get the reason out of her. A classmate had said her family was going to lose the diner, that everybody knew, that her brother couldn't pay for it. Tilly hadn't cried about it. She'd just gone quiet in a way that worried him more than crying would have. "People say things they don't know anything about," he'd told her. "But is it true?" He hadn't lied to her. "It might be. I'm trying to make sure it isn't." That had been enough for her, for one night. It wasn't enough for him. Their mother had died when Truett was 12. He didn't tell people the whole of it, not even Tilly, not yet. The winter their mother's cancer treatment ate through every dollar the family had. The gas company shut off their heat 2 days before Christmas, over a bill that came to less money than some people spent on dinner out. Truett remembered the exact sound the furnace made when it stopped, a small mechanical sigh, and then nothing. He remembered his father standing in the kitchen with the shut-off notice in one hand and the phone in the other, calling everyone he could think of, and getting nowhere, because it was 2 days before Christmas, and every office that could have helped was already closed. Their mother, already weak, spent 3 nights under every blanket in the house before a neighbor noticed the dark windows and got the heat restored. She died 4 months later. The doctors never said the cold made it worse. Truett had never once believed them. He never forgot the number on that overdue bill either. $61. He could have recited it in his sleep at 29 the same as he could have at 12. Some part of him had been carrying it around for 17 years, the way other people carried grudges or debts of their own. So when he saw a woman crying quietly at the counter of the gas company's payment office, 6 years ago on a Tuesday he'd only stopped into because his own bill was due, he didn't think about it very long. The payment office had that particular fluorescent hum every government-adjacent building seemed to share, and a line of 11 people ahead of him, and a radio behind the counter playing something with too much static to name. She was maybe 28, exhausted in the specific way of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks, staring at a shut-off notice like it was written in a language she'd have to learn overnight. Her hands were shaking around the paper hard enough that the clerk had asked her to repeat her account number twice. He'd stepped up to the counter, paid the balance in cash before she could say anything, and walked out before she could ask his name. He didn't wait to see her expression change. He was 3 cars down in the parking lot before he let himself think about why his hands were shaking a little too. He didn't remember her face anymore. He remembered the shape of the moment more than the woman in it, the way you remember weather instead of a specific day. He had never once connected that Tuesday to anything that happened after. Across town at Brackenridge Community Bank, Adeline Everly kept a framed photo of nobody on her desk and a reputation for reading every loan file twice before she'd recommend it. The other loan officers called Winthrop the wall behind his back, not unkindly, more the way you'd describe weather you'd learned to plan around. Nobody remembered the last time he'd approved an exception request without a fight, and most had simply stopped bringing him borderline files at all, routing around him the way water finds a lower path. "Everly, you want the Duffields file or should I hand it off?" her supervisor asked, dropping a folder on her desk. "I'll take it." She didn't know why she said it that fast. Something about the name tugged at her, faint and unplaceable, the way a smell can remind you of a room before you remember why. She opened the file. 29-year-old owner, family diner, 38 years in business, behind on the note after a run of bad luck, father's medical bills, a walk-in freezer on its last legs, a slow winter, nothing unusual. She had seen 100 files like it, the same quiet arithmetic of bad timing stacked on bad timing, the kind of file that rarely survived committee unless somebody in the room decided to fight for it. She did not remember, because she had spent 6 years making sure she never had to. A Tuesday afternoon when a stranger's hand had set cash on a counter in front of her and a shut-off notice had turned in about 4 seconds from a catastrophe into a piece of paper she could throw away. She had told exactly no one at the bank about the year her marriage ended, and her job disappeared in the same season. It had happened fast, one thing tipping into the next, until she was doing the math on heat versus groceries at 11 o'clock at night, trying to make 31 days of expenses fit into a paycheck built for 22. She had been too proud to call her parents and too embarrassed to tell her friends how close to the edge she actually was. She remembered exactly what it felt like to stand at a counter with a shut-off notice in her hand and no plan behind her eyes. She had cried in a bathroom at a coffee shop that same week, quietly, the kind of crying you do with the tap running so nobody hears it through the door. She kept a drawer in her apartment with a working space heater in it that she never used and never got rid of either in case. She had never once used it, 6 years running, and she had never once thrown it away either. She had also never once wondered, until this file landed on her desk, whether the hand that had fixed her worst week had a name attached to it. "You're quiet today," her coworker Marguerite said, passing her desk. "Big file?" "Just an old feeling. It's nothing." "You get that look about twice a year, and it's never actually nothing." "Noted." "It's still nothing." Adeline closed the folder and reached for her coffee, mostly so she'd have somewhere else to look. It was not, in fact, nothing, though she wouldn't understand that for months. She scheduled a site visit for the following week. It was standard procedure for loans over a certain size, and she told herself that was the only reason. The bell over the diner door caught her attention before anything else did. Not because it was unusual, because a boy behind the counter, maybe 29, was reaching up and giving the flickering neon open sign 3 short taps in the corner, and it steadied, glowing solid red, the way it apparently only would if you knew exactly where to hit it. "Ms. Everly?" Truitt wiped his hand before offering it. Didn't expect the bank to send somebody who shows up on time. Something about the set of his jaw when he said it snagged at her, brief and gone before she could hold on to it. She'd never met this man in her life. She told herself that twice, fast, and shook his hand. "I try to be memorable," Adeline said, and her own sentence came out stranger than she meant it, her free hand tightening on the strap of her bag for a second before she let it go. "That sign do that a lot?" she asked, nodding at it. "Every morning. My dad rigged something loose in there 20 years ago and never fixed it right. Taught me the exact spot to hit it instead. Said fixing the wire was a job for a man with money, and tapping it was a job for a man with patience. He shrugged. We had more patience than money most years. I like that philosophy. Why not just fix the wire? Adeline asked. Seems easier than tapping it every morning. Probably is. But my dad taught me the tap before he ever taught me anything about wiring, and some habits outlast the reason you started them. Truett shrugged. A thing that's kept working for 30 years because somebody bothered to learn exactly where to hit it. I figure that's earned the right to stay a little stubborn. She'd read the file twice on the drive over. She still hadn't shaken the odd, low-grade feeling that had followed her since she opened it. The sense of standing somewhere she'd already been without remembering the way in. You want coffee while you tell me how bad the news is? Coffee first, Adeline said, then the truth, in that order. Tilly appeared from the back booth where she'd been doing homework, sizing Adeline up with the particular seriousness of a 10-year-old evaluating a stranger's intentions. Are you the bank lady who's going to take our diner? Tilly, I'm the bank lady who's going to try very hard not to, Adeline said, crouching to Tilly's height. Is that a fair answer? It's better than the last one who came here. He didn't even sit down. Well, I'm sitting down. Adeline spent 40 minutes going through the numbers with Truett at the counter. Halfway through, an old man in a canvas jacket shuffled in, sat at the far stool without being greeted by name, and Truett had a plate in front of him within 90 seconds, no order taken out loud. Manny doesn't always have it, Truett said quietly, catching her watching. We don't make a thing of it. She wrote that down too, in the margin, in handwriting she'd later have trouble explaining to herself. Somewhere in the middle of the 40 minutes, watching him refill a regular's coffee without being asked and slide a to-go box to the old man who clearly wasn't going to pay for it, she found herself writing notes that had nothing to do with collateral value. You give away a lot of food, she said. I feed the ones who need it. My dad did the same. Bad week for business math, good week for everything else. That's not usually what gets a loan approved. No, Truett said. I don't imagine it is. She left with a stack of numbers that didn't quite add up to a safe recommendation, and a feeling in her chest she couldn't file anywhere. She came back 3 evenings later, off the clock, telling herself it was a follow-up question about the equipment fund. She stayed for dinner instead, sitting in the same booth Tilly did her homework in, splitting a slice of pie she hadn't ordered because Truett had set it down without asking. You don't have to keep feeding the bank, Adeline said. I'm not feeding the bank, I'm feeding you. There's a difference. He wiped down the counter, not looking up. Bank closes at 5. You're still here at 7. Force of habit. I like finishing what I start. Tilly, without looking up from a word problem about trains leaving 2 stations, said, She likes it here. She keeps coming back and it's not even about the money anymore. Tilly, what? It's true. You can tell by how long she stays. Adeline didn't have the comeback for that and didn't try to find one. She helped Tilly with the second half of the train problem instead and didn't leave until well past 8, and told herself the whole drive home that none of it meant anything beyond a file she wanted to get right. She caught herself, at a red light 2 blocks from her apartment, smiling for no reason she could name, and made herself stop before the light turned green, because smiling about a defaulted loan file felt like something she wasn't ready to examine too closely. She spent the next week building an exception case, the way she'd built a dozen others for people whose spreadsheets didn't tell the whole story. There was language in Brackenridge's community lending charter about supporting long-standing local businesses through hardship, language nobody had invoked in 3 years because it required a manager's sign-off nobody wanted to chase down. You're really going to push this one, her supervisor said. Everly, the collateral valuation alone is going to be a fight. Somebody logged the kitchen square footage wrong on the original appraisal. It's under-collateralized on paper by $11,000. Then I'll get the appraisal corrected. That's not usually how this works. Nothing about this file is usual. That night she called Marguerite, more to hear it out loud than to ask permission. I keep thinking about how many files like this I've closed the file on and moved to the next one. I don't want to do that with this one. You know, pushing this hard on a file with no upside for you is how people end up on Winthrop's radar for the wrong reasons. I know. You don't sound worried about that. I'm not, Adeline said, and meant it, and wasn't entirely sure why yet. That same week, on her lunch break, she fixed a decimal error that had wrongly denied a bakery owner named Corliss a small equipment loan. It wasn't Adeline's file. She fixed it anyway, and left before Corliss could get her name onto anything but a thank you card addressed to nobody in particular. You didn't have to do that, Corliss called after her. That's not even your account. No, but it was wrong and I know how to fix it. That's usually enough. It was the kind of thing Adeline did and never told anyone about. Not even to explain why she kept a stack of blank thank you cards in her desk drawer that she never signed. At Duffield's, Tilly found the ledger. It had been her father's, a battered spiral notebook kept behind the register the cover soft and gray at the corners from 30 years of hands. Inside were names in small amounts and the word paid crossed out in different pens over different years, a private accounting of every stranger their father had quietly helped and never mentioned at dinner, a tow bill for a widow 2 streets over, a prescription copay for a dishwasher who'd worked there one summer. Tilly had found it before, flipping through it the way kids flip through anything left unlocked, but she'd never stopped on one entry long enough to ask about it until today. Truett, who's A? Truett looked up from the grill. What? It's in Dad's book, from 6 years ago. Just an initial, a dollar amount, and gas co, paid, no name given. Is that the bank lady? His hands went still on the spatula. I don't know. Could be anybody. An initial doesn't tell you much. You always say there's no such thing as a coincidence when I lose things and then find them again. That's different. How? He didn't have an answer for that. 6 years was not 17 years. This was a different debt entirely, someone else's, paid the same quiet way his mother's never had been. He put the ledger in the drawer under the register and didn't look at it again for 3 days, because some part of him was afraid of what it would mean if he was right, and a bigger part was afraid of what it would mean if he was wrong. Director Selwyn Winthrop reviewed the exception request from behind a desk that held exactly one photograph, an old black and white shot of a hardware store, a family standing in front of it, turned at an angle that kept it from facing visitors directly. Nobody on staff had ever asked him about it. Whatever it was, he had built 11 years of careful denials on top of it. Ms. Everly, the collateral is short. The applicant has a pattern of giving away inventory, and frankly, the emotional appeal of a family diner doesn't change the math. The appraisal is wrong, Director. I can get it corrected in a week. A week we don't have to give him, given the note's already in default. He straightened the photograph a half-inch, a habit she'd noticed before and never asked about. I've seen what happens when a bank decides a good story is the same thing as a good loan. It rarely ends the way people hope. Which story? Adeline asked. Whose? That's not relevant to this file. He closed it. Denied pending appeal. That's the most I can offer today. She left his office and stood in the hallway for a moment, the way you stand still after a door closes harder than you expected, and thought, not for the first time, that there was something underneath Selwyn Winthrop's calm that he had spent a very long time keeping folded shut. A week into the fight over the file, Truett thought he'd finally found her. He'd started doing it without quite admitting to himself he was doing it, watching every woman roughly the right age who walked through the door a beat too long, waiting for something to click. It felt foolish even as he did it, and he did it anyway, because some part of him needed the 6-year-old debt to have a face attached to it, needed the stranger from the payment counter to be a person, and not just a shape in his memory. A woman paid for a stranger's coffee on a Thursday, quiet about it, the same way he'd done it once himself, and left before the stranger could thank her properly. Truett's heart went sideways. He came around the counter before she reached the door. Excuse me, did you used to live on the east side, maybe 6 years back, at the gas company on Route 14? The woman blinked at him. I've lived in this town my whole life, but I've never once been late on a gas bill. Sorry to disappoint you. No, I'm sorry, wrong person. He stood there a long moment after she left, feeling foolish in a way he hadn't expected, and didn't tell Tilly about it that night, because admitting he'd started looking for a stranger in every face that walked through the door felt like admitting something he wasn't ready to say out loud. He thought about it anyway, alone, after closing. A stranger's kindness was supposed to be a single afternoon, a thing that happened once and stayed put in memory. He hadn't expected it to still be looking for somewhere to land, 6 years later, in every face that reminded him of nothing in particular. He wiped down the same stretch of counter 3 times that afternoon, which was how he'd always dealt with feeling foolish, and told himself the search was over, that he'd embarrassed himself once and that was enough. He was wrong about that, though not in a way he'd have guessed. Word about the default notice had gotten around town by then, the way it always did, one regular telling another over the counter. Manny tried to leave $200 folded under his coffee cup, and Truett caught him at the door and made him take it back. A retired schoolteacher offered to start a collection jar by the register. Truett thanked her and declined that too. You'll let us pay for a slice of pie, but not for the roof, Tilly said, watching him turn away another offer. That's different. You keep saying that, you never say how. He didn't have a good answer for her this time either. The truth, the part he couldn't quite say out loud even to a 10-year-old, was that taking money from people who could barely spare it felt like exactly the kind of quiet damage he'd spent his whole life trying to stop, and he would rather lose the building than be the reason Manny went without something he needed to spare $200 he didn't have. Getting the correction meant driving out to the original assessor's office herself with a tape measure and the diner's floor plan, because 2 phone calls and an email had gotten her nothing but a promise to look into it. She walked the kitchen with the assessor in person, pointed out the storage room he'd apparently forgotten to include, and stood there while he remeasured it twice to be sure. It took an afternoon she didn't officially have to spare, and a favor she'd have to explain to her supervisor eventually, and she found she didn't much care about either cost. 2 days later, the appraisal correction came through. $11,000 restored to the collateral value, the file finally strong enough to survive an audit. Adeline resubmitted it the same afternoon. That evening, the walk-in freezer at Duffield's died sometime after close. Truitt found it the next morning standing in the doorway, one hand on the frame, the smell already telling him everything the thermometer would only confirm. $3,100 of inventory gone soft and unsellable. The compressor was a wheeze of dead metal he couldn't afford to replace and couldn't afford not to. $3,100 was almost exactly what he had left in the business account after the last loan payment, which meant restocking the walk-in and covering payroll this week were now, mathematically, the same fight over the same dollar. He stood there long enough that Tilly came looking for him before school, and he sent her on without telling her why his voice sounded the way it did. He was still standing in the ruined walk-in, doing math that didn't work no matter which way he arranged it, when the health inspector arrived for a routine visit and found, in addition to the freezer, a kitchen heating system old enough to fail 2 safety checks in a row. "I have to cite you for both, Mr. Duffield. The freezer's a food safety violation and the heating system's a code violation. I can't let you keep serving until they're both fixed. How long do I have?" "Effective today. You're closed until it's resolved." He called 3 suppliers before noon, trying to find anyone who'd extend him credit on a freezer repair, and got the same careful, apologetic no from all 3. He called the emergency repair line last, and the earliest appointment they had was 9 days out. Truitt stood behind his own counter, in his own diner, for the first time in 14 years with the doors locked in the middle of a Tuesday, and did not know how to explain to a 10-year-old why the lights would stay off for a while. That was the same week, though neither of them said it out loud, that Adeline's exception request reached Selwyn Winthrop's desk a second time, this time with a repaired appraisal and a clean file. "The appraisal's fixed, Director. The collateral is sound. There's no reason left to deny this. There's a new one." He slid the health department notice across the desk without looking up. "A closed business is not a stable business, Ms. Everly, whatever the reason for the closure. I'm sorry." "You're not sorry. You're careful. Those aren't the same thing." He didn't answer that. He denied the request a second time, citing the closure as fresh evidence of instability, and Adeline walked out of his office for the second time in 2 weeks with the distinct, uncomfortable sense that his carefulness was covering for something she hadn't found yet. Truitt sat with Tilly on the back step of the closed diner that night. "We might have to let it go," he said, quiet, the words costing him more than she could see. "Let it go where?" "Somebody's offered to buy the building. Turn it into a storage place or a laundromat, I don't know. Enough money to pay off what we owe. Enough to get you somewhere warm." "We're already warm." "Not if the bank has its way, we're not." He hadn't meant to say the rest of it. It came out anyway, quiet, in the dark, the way things do when you've held them too long alone. He told her about their mother, the real version, the shut-off notice 2 days before Christmas and the 3 cold nights in the 4 months after that. Nobody in the family had ever called what it actually was. Tilly listened without moving, 10 years old and suddenly holding something much older than that. "Is that why you're the one who always writes the ledger entries now? Why you never let anybody's heat get shut off if you can help it?" "I didn't know you'd notice that." "I notice more than you think I do." Tilly was quiet for a long moment. "Dad wouldn't sell it. Dad's not the one who has to figure out how to feed you next month." He didn't sleep that night. He sat at the kitchen table with the developer's card in front of him, turning it over and over, and thought about his father's hands on that same table, and his mother's cold bedroom, and the $61 that had followed him for 17 years without once asking permission. He thought about the woman at the payment counter 6 years ago, and wondered, not for the first time, whether she'd ever managed to pay someone else's bill the way he'd paid hers, or whether kindness like that only ever moved in one direction before it disappeared. In the morning, he called the number the developer's agent had left 3 weeks earlier. "Mr. Duffield, I wasn't expecting to hear back from you so soon. I've got a health department closure and a bank that isn't returning my calls. I don't have a lot of soon left in me. I'm sorry to hear that, genuinely. This isn't the way I like these to go, for what it's worth." Her voice had the careful gentleness of someone who'd delivered this same conversation many times before. "We can move fast if that helps. Thursday morning if you want it over with quickly." "Thursday's fine. You understand once you sign, there's no unwinding it. I want to be clear about that part. I understand. He didn't. Not really. Not the way he would by Thursday. But he said it anyway, because there wasn't anything else left to say that morning. He unplugged the open sign on his way out that evening, for the first time in 38 years. The switch made almost no sound. That was the part that surprised him. How quiet the end of something could be after all the noise it took to keep it going. He stood on the sidewalk looking at the dark window for a long moment, the glass reflecting nothing but the streetlight, before he made himself walk away from it. He walked past 3 closed shops on his way to the car, a laundromat, a shuttered hardware store, a nail salon with a faded for lease sign in the window, and thought, without much comfort, that Duffield's would just be one more dark window on a street that already had plenty. The desk clerk at the bank told Adeline what had happened almost by accident, mentioning the closure in passing while pulling another file. Adeline sat very still for a second, the pen in her hand hovering over a signature line that suddenly didn't matter, before she understood all at once why the name Duffield's had never quite stopped tugging at her since the day it landed on her desk. She left the office without her coat. She didn't remember the drive, only that her hands were steady on the wheel in a way the rest of her wasn't. The windows were dark when she got there, the sign unlit, a hand-lettered closed sign taped inside the glass at an angle that told her nobody had taken care hanging it. She found Tilly on the front step, wrapped in a coat too big for her, waiting for a neighbor to come let her in somewhere warm. "Where's your brother?" "Signing papers tomorrow. He's going to sell it." Tilly looked up at her, and there was something in the girl's face too old for 10. "There's an A in Dad's old book. 6 years ago, gas company, no name given. I think it's you. He looked for you, you know. He thought he found you once, and it wasn't you. And he never told me, but I could tell it broke something in him a little." Adeline's hands had gone cold, and not from the weather. She didn't sleep either. She sat up with the old receipt from her own drawer spread out on the kitchen table, next to the folded thank you cards she'd never sent to Corliss or anyone else, and understood fully for the first time that she had spent 6 years thanking nobody because she'd never let herself find out who deserved it. She was in the car before 6, the receipt in her coat pocket, the space heater still in its drawer where it had sat unused for 6 years, and she drove to the bank instead of the diner because Tilly had told her the signing was there, first thing, before the doors even opened to regular customers. She found Truitt at the bank the next morning, standing outside the closing office with a folder under his arm and a man from the developer's firm waiting inside. Truitt. He turned, and for a moment his face did something she'd never seen on him before, something raw and unguarded. "Ms. Everly, I don't have good news today, and neither do I until about 11 minutes ago." She reached into her bag and pulled out a folded gas company receipt, 6 years old, soft at the creases from being carried and never used. "You paid this. 6 years ago. Route 14 Payment Center. You didn't ask my name." Truitt went very still. "You were a stranger crying at a counter," he said slowly. "I never saw your face again after that day. I looked for you. I actually looked once and got it wrong, and I never told anyone how much that stung. I kept this receipt in a drawer for 6 years and never told anyone why. I told myself it was nothing. It was not nothing." Her voice caught and held anyway. "You paid it and left before I could even say thank you. I have spent 6 years being the person who reads other people's hardship on paper and hands down a verdict, and I never once let myself think about the day somebody looked at mine and didn't hand down anything. They just fixed it. I don't know what to do with that," Truitt said. "Except maybe walk into that office and stop being the man who's about to sign this building away? Then don't sign anything yet." She reached past him and, with the flat of her hand, gave 3 short taps to the light switch panel on the wall outside the office, the exact gesture Tilly had described to her the night before, a habit she'd watched Truitt do without knowing what it would come to mean. Nothing lit up. It was just a switch on a bank wall. But Truitt laughed once, a short broken sound, because she'd done it anyway, without being told. The way you do a thing you've only seen someone else do and understood in your body before your mind caught up. "There's a board meeting in 5 days, Adeline said. "I intend to walk into it and tell every person in that room exactly who you are, whether or not it costs me my job." He thought about Manny's $200, folded and refused, and what it had cost him to say no to that. This felt different, and he couldn't yet say why, only that some refusals protected people, and this one would only protect his pride. "You don't have to do that for me." "I'm not doing it for you," Adeline said. "I've spent 6 years letting a stranger be the only person who ever really saw me on a bad day, and I didn't even know it was you. I'm doing it because I'm tired of being a name on a receipt nobody ever thanked out loud." Truitt looked at her for a long moment, the folder still under his arm, the developer's man still waiting behind the glass. 5 days, he said finally. What do I do until then? You open the diner, you flip the sign, tap it 3 times, and you feed whoever walks in. That's what you do until then. She almost smiled. It's what you're good at. And if the board says no anyway, then I'll have told the truth in front of a room full of people who needed to hear it, and we'll figure out the next part after that. I'm not promising you a miracle, Truett. I'm promising you I'm not going to let this get buried quietly, the way it almost did twice already. Adeline spent the 4 nights before the hearing writing and rewriting what she planned to say, crossing out every version that sounded like she was asking for pity instead of stating a fact. She thought about the space heater in her drawer and the thank you cards she'd never signed, and understood that the version of the speech that scared her most was also the only one that was actually true. She wrote that one down last, and didn't change it again. The boardroom at Brackenridge smelled like new carpet and old coffee, and every chair was full that Thursday. Duffield's regulars had packed into the back in coats they hadn't taken off, word having traveled the way it does in a town small enough for a diner to matter. Manny was there, and the neighbor who'd let Tilly in the night before, and a dozen faces Adeline recognized from 100 breakfast rushes she'd only witnessed twice. Tilly sat in the front row with her knees pulled up to her chest, watching her brother's hands instead of his face. Adeline stood before the 5-person loan committee, with Selwyn Winthrop at the head of the table, and told them about a payment counter on Route 14, a shut-off notice, and a stranger who'd fixed it without waiting to be thanked. Ms. Everly, one committee member interrupted, are you telling this board you have a personal history with the applicant? That's a disclosure matter, not a sympathy matter. I'm telling you I have a personal history with the exact hardship this charter exists to address, Adeline said. 6 years ago, I was the kind of case this bank is supposed to help, and instead I fell through the cracks, and a line cook caught me before I hit the ground. I didn't recognize his name on a file. I recognized the exact way he taps a light switch. I'm telling you this in front of everyone because I would rather risk my job telling the truth than keep it by staying quiet about the hole this policy is supposed to fill. The room went silent. Selwyn Winthrop's hand, resting on the closed file in front of him, had gone still. Another committee member leaned forward. And if the board declines to approve this, Ms. Everly, what happens to you professionally for standing up here and saying all this? I imagine there are consequences. I decided a while ago I'd rather live with those than with the alternative, which is going home tonight knowing I let a technicality bury the one file I actually understood. The collateral is sound, Adeline went on, steadier. The appraisal error is corrected and documented. The temporary closure is due to a repair timeline, not instability, and I have a signed contractor's estimate proving it. I am not asking this board for charity. I am asking it to follow its own charter. The board did not simply hand the loan back. They approved it, restructured, on the condition of a 12-month supervised repayment plan with quarterly reviews and a mandatory equipment maintenance fund. It was not a gift. It was a second chance with real oversight attached, and everyone in the room understood the difference. This isn't approved because it's a good story, the chairwoman said, not unkindly. It's approved because the numbers corrected support it. We will be checking in every quarter, Mr. Duffield. Every quarter's fine by me, Truett said. Nobody's checked on us in a long time. I don't mind it. In the back row, someone started clapping before the chairwoman had fully finished speaking, and it spread through the room the way applause does when people have been holding their breath together for longer than they meant to. Tilly didn't clap. She put her face in her hands instead, and Truett crossed the room in 4 steps and put both arms around her, and neither of them said anything for a while, because there wasn't anything that needed saying out loud in front of that many people. Selwyn Winthrop said almost nothing during the vote. He voted with the majority, and afterward, when the room emptied, he sat alone with the folder in front of him for a long time. Adeline found him there. You paused on his address the first time you opened the file, she said. I saw it. Why? He didn't look up right away. When he finally did, something in his face had loosened, the way a held breath loosens a chest. My father's hardware store was 3 doors down from that address, 30 years ago. It failed. We'd borrowed against everything. My mother's ring, my grandfather's truck, and none of it was enough. And I watched my father hand the keys to a bank manager who called it a personal failing instead of bad luck. I stood right there next to him. He didn't cry in front of me. He waited until we got to the car. He turned the photograph slightly, so it faced her for the first time since she'd started coming to this office. I was 25. I decided that day I would never again let a bank hand somebody a loan it couldn't actually help them survive. I built a whole career out of protecting people from what happened to him. 11 years of careful denials, Ms. Everly. I told myself every one of them was mercy. I never once asked whether protecting people looked the same from where they were standing as denying them. Truett Duffield never asked for charity, Adeline said. He asked for a corrected number. That's not the same story as your father's. No, it isn't. I've known that since about the second sentence of your testimony, and I still haven't decided what I'm supposed to do with knowing it. You don't have to decide today, but if the charter language stays a shelf decoration instead of something anyone can actually use, I'm taking this to the full board myself, publicly, until somebody fixes it. That sounds like a threat, Ms. Everly. It's a boundary, Director. I've gotten good at those recently. She didn't forgive him on the spot, and he didn't ask her to. What he did over the following month mattered more than an apology would have. He rewrote the hardship exception process himself, with input from 3 loan officers, including Adeline, removing the language that let a single director quietly bury a case without review, and he brought the draft to her before he brought it to the board. It took him 4 drafts. She sent the first 3 back with margin notes sharper than anything she'd ever written in an official file, and he took every one of them without argument, which surprised her more than an apology would have. He never once asked her to soften a note or explain why she'd made it. There's still a loophole here, she said, pen tapping the page. Discretionary override, unlimited. Where? Right there. That's the same door that almost buried Truett's file. He looked at it a long moment, then struck the line and rewrote it. Every override requires a second signature and a written reason. Better? Better, Adeline said. It's not forgiveness, it's just better. I didn't ask for forgiveness. I know, she said. That's why I'm still in this room. Selwyn Winthrop was still the wall a year later, in most respects. But the loan officers had started bringing him borderline files again, because word had gotten around that he'd actually started reading them twice before he said no, and sometimes he didn't say no at all. A year later, Truett flipped the open sign at 5 in the morning the way he had every day since the loan cleared, and it caught on the first try. Steady. The wiring finally fixed for real with money from the equipment fund the board had approved. Tilly sat at the counter doing homework, older by a year, sharper with her fractions than ever. Adeline came by most mornings now for coffee before her shift, and stayed longer than coffee usually took. Does this mean the ledger's full? Tilly asked once, flipping through their father's old notebook, the one still kept behind the register. The ledger's never full, Truett said. People are always going to need something paid for quietly. We just get to be pickier now about which mornings we can afford it. He hadn't gotten his parents back. Nobody pretended that was how any of this worked. Some mornings the cold still meant something different to him than it did to the customers complaining about the weather and probably always would. But most mornings now, there were 3 people behind that counter instead of 1. And on the hard days, the ones where 17 years doesn't just quietly resolve itself because a stranger turned out to have a name, Adeline sat with him the way a stranger once sat with her, without asking anything in return. The following winter, colder than the last one had any business being, Tilly saw a boy about her age standing outside the laundromat 2 doors down, no coat, breath fogging in the cold. She didn't ask her brother's permission. She went into the diner, grabbed the smallest coat off the lost and found hook, the one that had sat there unclaimed for a month, and carried it out to him herself while Truett, watching from the window, let her go. She held it out to the boy without a word at first, the way she'd seen her brother do it 100 times without teaching her on purpose. Here, it's cold. She helped him get his arm through the sleeve, the way you'd help someone whose hands were too numb to manage it alone. And then she turned and walked back inside, already thinking about what page of her homework she'd left off on, already certain, the way only a 10-year-old in a diner full of regulars could be certain of the same thing at once, that some doors stay open because somebody keeps deciding to hold them that way. She didn't ask his name either. She just held the door,